further, I didn't come here to I lecture language, of course, but I don't think that we get too much out of lectures. If we can address ourselves to things that are of great interest to you or that puzzle you and so on, we can be of much greater help to each other. And so what I will just make, as I did yesterday in the session on the Bible, a number of remarks to set the stage, and then I'll turn it over to you. I have 3 children, 2 boys and 1 daughter. Some of the finest children that God ever got around to making, I think. And Francis, my youngest son, incidentally, I named him Francis Albert Bonney, after Francis of Assisi, Albert Schweitzer, in the hope that it would make it easier for us to make a saint out of him. Every time I visit Francis now, I remind him of that fact. And we haven't given up, we are still working on it. Francis is now playing on Broadway. He is at the Phantom of the Opera. But he was traveling the world with a Glenn Miller band, the first thing he did. And they got to Japan and spent, I don't know, quite some time in Japan with their music. And when Francis came home, he said, "Daddy, I've come to love Buddha." So I took the time to make a careful study of Buddhism. My son still now, 18 years later, every morning he goes up to the 3rd floor of his house in New York to pray. And I've gone to pray with him. I have chanted with him, and I've enjoyed the beauty that Buddhism has brought into his life. Somehow his soul simply responded to it. He's also a Christian. He belongs to Riverside Church, the great cathedral built by Harry Emerson Bobby. One day Francis came to my study when he was a little boy. He said, "Daddy, how could I have been responsible for killing Jesus?" So I had a chance to talk with that child about theology. Not long after that, I had a counseling service at that time in Kansas City. A mother brought her little daughter, their only child, and told me that the child was screaming at night, "I didn't do it, I didn't do it, I didn't do it." She wanted me to find out what had gone wrong. I found out in time, after loving, because she was so frightened, through love and conversation and so on. I found out that she too had been told in her Sunday school class that she was responsible for having killed Jesus. That's fundamentalism. That is a rank fundamentalism. That's what the atonement means. And I shall finish my remarks by explaining to you the atonement theory. To come back to Jesus now, I just wanted you to see how these misrepresentations of a beautiful and decent thing can bring so much harm to human life and human relations. When we use the term idolatry, we usually mean something of a derogatory nature, which is wrong. Because idolatry is also the result of something that you love. The idolatry about which we are going to speak in regards to Jesus was created by his friends because they wanted to find some way of saying how much they loved him. And so they created all sorts of stuff that had absolutely nothing to do with the man of Galilee, who was a simple boy born into a wretched family that had never enough bread to eat. And it has stuck to him, and now we can't do it today anymore, but we used to burn them at the stake, anybody who wouldn't refuse these, what Arnold Toynbee calls historical accretions. And so Jesus got buried under idolatry, and many of, all of us, I would say, really, including myself, carry in our thinking, in our feeling, in our vocabulary, some of the idolatry we have for Jesus, whom many of us love. What I was going to say about Buddha, that my son fell in love with, is, I've made a careful study of it. He's considered perhaps the most humane, the greatest religious leader in the world. But when you deal with Christians, of course, they feel that Jesus was greater than Buddha, and maybe he was, I don't know. But Buddha, when he died, Buddha has the only religion that is purely ethical. He didn't believe in heaven, he didn't believe in hell, he didn't know whether there was a God or not, and he instructed his disciples that they should build no shrines to his memory, no monuments, no statues, and no discipleship. In that regard, he out-Quakered the Quakers, because he said that every human being has to do what I have done. Search until he finds his own fulfillment in life. And you can't do that by accepting Buddha's insights. In 200 years, Buddha was not born by a simple mother. Well, she was not simple. They were very wealthy people. He came out of a noble family. In 200 years, Buddha was no longer born by a woman. He was born in a lotus flower. And somewhere in the East, in some of my travels, I've seen Buddha got a little heavy after a while for lotus flowers, but you know, Buddha was a scrawny fellow, and why they kept on adding at the wrong place, I don't know. But Buddha, in time, to embellish him, the idolatry of his friends, had him born. He had to be different than other people, so they had him born in a lotus flower. Before long you had shrines, before long you had monuments, and before long you had all the things that we have in regards to Jesus. Jesus had no idea that there would ever be a church, that there would be, of course he didn't think of discipleship, but he wanted to have friends that would attempt to live somewhat similar as he had lived. And so this is a universal phenomenon, that whenever, for instance, Alexander the Great, one of the great military leaders, also had to be born later on, not by a virgin, but by a goddess. And there are many things in his life, in Greek national history, that have absolutely nothing to do with history. They are inventions of a people that are proud of one of their great military leaders. And this goes for all of these great men, with the exception of Gandhi. But give Gandhi 200 more years and we'll have him wrapped up in God knows how many blankets until you can't find the man. It wouldn't take very much to wrap him up anyway, because there was a little left by the time he died. It was nothing but skin and bones. The other thing that the disciples of Jesus faced was about 200 years before Jesus was born, a cult started, which is known in history as the Mithras cult. You can read about this in any, I guess, history of Christianity, in the early stages of Christianity. The Mithras cult looked very much like the history of Jesus. They had a crucifixion once a year. Their hero died, was buried. Then during the night somebody got the body. In 3 days, Mithras was supposed to rise and they would go back to the cemetery and the grave was empty. So the promise had been fulfilled. Mithras had risen and become immortal. When Jesus came along 200 years later, the Mithraism had spread into the Roman Empire, and they were meeting the Mithras disciples everywhere. And since the people committed to Jesus, of course, wanted to make a success of his ministry, his teachings, and so on, they had to compete with Mithras. And so they took over more and more of the Mithras myth into Christian theology in order to outwit the spread of the Mithras cult. I think I have it in my car, tore a page out of, I think it was Time magazine, just a few days ago, before I came here. There's some 50 scholars from some dozen different countries. These are real scholars, I mean, people who have devoted a great deal of effort and time to this question, have published, I think, a book or a booklet, maybe the first release, which will be modified later. And they came to the conclusion that only 20% of all the words that you have in the New Testament about Jesus were actually spoken by him. 20%, and of course they use very technical linguistic approaches to figure this out and to establish a fact of that sort. So we must never be too dogmatic. There is so much good and beauty in the New Testament that whether it was written by Jesus, said by Jesus or not, if it was written by Paul, I'd be careful, because I don't trust him quite as much. And I'll give you the reason why later on. Now somebody behind the mic this morning, as I was walking into the hall, was referring to this guy Jesus. I don't think Jesus would have objected to that, because he never looked upon himself. There is one statement in the book of John, and John is no biography of Jesus, let me tell that to you, that he and the Father were one. But I don't think that Jesus ever looked upon himself as being something a lot more than all the other miserable people with whom he had to make a living in his time. To me, he is the man of Galilee. And what amuses me is the difficulty Quakers have with Christ. Yeah. Because there is a very clear distinction between Jesus. You speak about, I mean, you have a right to speak about Jesus the way you talk about Kant or Socrates or Plato or any of the other great philosophers, Confucius, Buddha. When you talk about Christ, you are involving 1,000 volumes of Christology that has been written about Jesus. How he saves and how he does this and how he does that and so on. And Quakers, for some reason, have difficulty accepting that, and I did too. And those of you who have read my book are aware of the agony to which I had to go for years trying to rid myself of so much of this totally unreliable material that has nothing to do with history, simply an invention of theologians and so on. So Jesus in my book was just a Galilean. His mother was a wonderful, I have once preached a sermon, people wept. Some women wept in the audience. I tried to describe Mary as a Jewish lady who had, when she was still a child, dreamt that someday she may have children. And she was going to raise them the best way she knew. And they would become a great benefit to mankind. And then one day Jesus was born. And she did what she could, transmitting all of her idealism into this little life. And Jesus became a great man. That is the man of Galilee. Before all the other things began to happen to him. One more, well, a few more examples. I once took a course, I don't know, I couldn't graduate, so I had to go to many universities. And at one of the universities, I took a course in the moral philosophers of the world. And we started with Confucius, who was just about one of the first ones in human history. And these people were stripped of all the Toynbean equations, historical equations, and they had to stand on their own feet. The scholars that had written that book were trying to show who these people were and why they are still remembered and what their benefit to mankind has been, what it consists of. And that struck me as something interesting. I was wondering when they got to some of my friends, like Socrates and some of the great prophets in the Old Testament, how these great scholars approaching it only from the ethical point of view would make of these men. But believe me, they got to Jesus eventually, coming through the Chinese, Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian evolution of life, and they are great thinkers and so on. And finally we got to Jesus. And when I was through with that course, I took my head off to Jesus. I began to realize this was one of the biggest breakthroughs in my life in regards to all the rigmarole into which they had wrapped Jesus and made a Christ out of him. Because Jesus, his merits, his quality, his value to mankind, had to stand on his own feet. And the philosophers who had written this book were trying to point out why Jesus is remembered and followed by more millions than any other human being that has ever lived. Without all the other things, just as a human being who had, I see Jesus, I think one of the greatest merits of Jesus in my catalog is that he had a remarkable identification with human beings. For instance, here, let me just give you a few examples. Here is the woman that was caught in adultery, and they just wanted to have the okay of Jesus so they could smash this poor creature under a pile of stones. And Jesus looked to these monsters, most of them Pharisees. And when they were through, he looked up and he said, I think before you do this, make sure that you have never sinned before yourself. And he waited for a while and half of them were gone. And before long, they had all vanished into the bushes. And he said to the woman, why don't you go and try a different way of life? can you do anything more compassionate and kind and understanding? And this was the quality of Jesus, his ability as a human being to identify with human suffering. And as a result, of course, he has been remembered for a long time. But to me, Jesus became a man, a full-grain man. After that, I began to take him seriously. As a child, when I listened to the stories in the Sunday school and so on, this was nothing with which I could identify or associate some phantasmagoria up there in the skies that had no legs or anything meaningful for me. Now, after this course in philosophy, moral philosophy, I began to respect Jesus. And I asked myself many times in a very critical situation, if Jesus were stuck in this place, what would he do? And then to the best of your ability, you try to behave similarly. Now let me give you the essence, at least, of the atonement theory. You all know what is meant by it, do you? No questions about the atonement. Or sometimes they translate it as one-ment and so on. I'll just give you in a nutshell the evolution of this concept. A woman who said to me at the dinner table last night asked me a question that really struck me, because, and I'll have to think about it for a long time. She said, why is it that human beings have to shed so much blood, whether it's in their religion or otherwise? Somehow there is something in us that psychiatrists have never been able to identify or to isolate, that feels that the universe is a brutish, moral creation, where if you don't behave right, you are going to be punished. And from that thesis, you jump to the conclusion that whenever somebody suffers, he must have done something evil. Job was trying to disprove this, but of course no one believed him. And no one makes anything of Job's. It's one of the greatest moral dramas ever written in antiquity. But no one listens to Job. Job says, there is no reason under the sun why I should suffer like this. That's beyond human reason. I have never deprived any one of his means. I have never done any harm. And with his friends insisting, you better get down on your knees and confess your sins, he said, to my memory, I have never sinned. And I say that too incidentally. I'm getting very old now, and I think if I'm going to do a little, I'll let it start very soon, because I'll never make it. Like that nun that I told you about in my lecture. When she realized she was leaving, she asked for 3 days off so that she could do a little sinning. The atonement theory is just a part of that whole bloody mess of human history. First, the Jews, as many primitive people, sacrificed human beings at a certain time of the year. Every year it was done on the same day, and it became a ritual. When that day came, a human being was selected, and he was sacrificed, murdered at the altar and burned. And as the centuries went by and people became a little more sensitive, they replaced human sacrifice. Incidentally, Abraham is one of the interesting things. I would never worship a God who tells me, I'd like to see how loyal you really are, so I want you to sacrifice your son. I would say, to hell with you. Because God comes to Abraham and tells him was waiting for a child for endless years. And then finally, in his ripe old age, this child is born, and then God tells him, now I want you to sacrifice him. So he goes and builds an altar, and just before he kills that little child, a goat shows up in the bushes, and he replaces the human being. This is when in Jewish history you made the switch from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice, from your own little son to the sheep. That went on for a long time, and as human sensitivity kept on evolving, in time they even looked upon an animal sacrifice as too cruel. And so they invented what you often, I think, still use and never think of it and don't know where it started, the scapegoat idea. Instead of on that day that had always been set aside for the sacrifice, they got a sheep, and the people would come together. The priest would lay his hand upon the sheep and under a prayer transfer the sins of the nation to this sheep, which was never killed, and sends it out into the desert, and the sins of the people for that year were forgiven. So you start with murdering human beings, so eventually putting the sins through a ritualistic prayer on a sheep, and you send it out into the world. Now let me show you how this, any questions about this? Now let me relate it, and this will be my last comment, and then I want you to respond, because I didn't come here to lecture. I want to relate this now to Jesus, to the little child being brought to my office, yelling at night, I didn't do it. Paul, who was a Pharisee, and I can imagine that man, he must have been something. He never married, I don't think any woman there wanted to live with him. And hateful. He went about collecting the Christians and having them sent to jail and having them murdered at the beginnings of Christianity. And what finally broke him, his arrogance, was the death of Stephen. I can imagine Stephen, one of the Gandhis of his day, when they were smashing his head with rocks. The last thing he did, he prayed for the people who were doing it. And even Paul couldn't take that one. So he left, and on the way, he collapsed and had a vision, and he became converted. Became a born-again Christian. What Paul did, this has nothing to do with Jesus. I mean, Jesus never talked about this. He took the story of Jesus, he had never met Jesus, and didn't know him, but of course heard a great deal about him from other people who were still living at that time, who had been friends of Jesus. And he identified the life of Jesus with the sacrificial tradition of the Old Testament. And he said that this is his logic, this is his rationale for the whole thing. That because Adam has sinned, God got angry, and he has been carrying a grudge against men ever since. He could never, because he was so hateful. God, in the Old Testament, of course, it's ruthless tyrant, no respect for human freedom or human rights and so on. And so God cannot have a proper relationship to human beings who have insulted him through the acts of Adam. Now, I got enough worries of my own instead of going back and seeing how I'm related to Adam. I don't need to worry about that. But this is the logic of that part of the theology. So the only way God could establish a meaningful relationship to the people was by murdering somebody. And Jesus became the great sacrifice. And then the theologians came along, especially the fundamentalists, and said that Jesus had to die so that you could live.
His friends say that, he was a transformed man, and he was, there was a radiance about him that set him apart from most other people, and of course he wrote those essays in the Testament of Devotion. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was one of these, a person who accepted Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God. I mean, I think that's. How do you respond to that? I mean, the transformation and the very inspiring words that he wrote.
You mean how he could write that,
even
though he believed in all the
theology, the Christian theology
of the Christhood of Jesus? But first of all, let me tell you that there is one thing that I can understand that I have in common with Thomas Kelly. He almost had a mental breakdown, and when his examination for the master's thesis came around, I had two mental breakdowns when my thesis came around. I had to write two. And so we had that in common. I could appreciate it. Also, when he finally, he went through a lot of spiritual agony, I think, before he finally found himself. When he finally came through the whole thing and didn't go insane, I think he verged on a mental breakdown a number of times. I really don't think I should speak about that, because the alchemy of the human organism is an incredible mysterious thing. And how all of a sudden things that have agonized you and that were unrelated and you didn't know what to do with, all of a sudden gel. And a moment of conversion takes place. And what really you mean by this conversion is that you all of a sudden feel in harmony with yourself. You are no longer fragmented, flying out in all different directions, and that's what came to Thomas Kelly near the end of his life. I know his son very well, Richard Kelly in Baltimore. I worked with him, and he wrote a biography about his father, but it made a really attempt to portray some of the things that happened, but I don't think Richard, despite the man to do that, did the best he could. So I can say what happened, because you take, isn't it Olson that was part of the Nixon right-hand, it's not his name, Olson. Colson. Yeah, Colson. I just met him again recently, and he's now working, I think, for prisoners in 32 different countries and so on. I don't make fun of those. Some people make fun of it, and when anybody comes up with the notion of being born again or twice born Christian and so on, all of us, one of our deepest longings, I think, is to be totally at peace with yourself. So that you can feel, you can have moments, of course they can't always continue and last because there are so many elements impinging upon our life. But one of the cravings we have in all of my ministry, I've been trying to help people somehow, if possible, to find a core around which they could all of a sudden become whole. I did it at Heidelberg University in Germany with the Hitlerjugend. These were the kids that grew up on the Rosenberg idiocy of racial superiority and so on. They were now, when I was there, they were in the university. And every now and then when we got through a night when we had only a little bit, the nation was still in ruins, some students had perhaps one meal a day. And we would sit all night in some garret, in some basement, and reason with each other. And sometimes in the morning, a fellow would throw his arms around me and weep. And say, now I can live again. And what had happened is, somehow in this conversation, I've never told anyone what to believe, and you don't ever get this from my book. The second edition, if I do get one out, I haven't decided yet, has a preface to it. People think that I wrote this to convert people to my point of view. Nothing like it. I simply told you where I came from and what happened to me, and how I worked myself through all of this debris and come out at the other end with a human being who embraces the universe. That's all. And you may be able to achieve the same thing, although I think you may have it difficult. I mean, I'm a bit special. but you have to achieve it in your own way. Because we are so different from each other. So, Thomas Kelly had one of those. Every one of these conversions, in some respects, is different, but the essence is the same. All of a sudden, under his enormous efforts and so on, intellectual efforts, especially, he was able to bring the strands together into a tapestry of life. And he died much happier person than he had ever been young.
You have not made clear, at least my understanding, whether you are suggesting that Thomas Kelly's Testament devotion is a result of his periods of irrationality or rationality.
Well, it's the result of his rationality describing his irrationality. Because he says, tracing where he came from and what the great stumbling blocks have been, and then he comes up. I used to be able to quote him. I've read him about 3 or 4 times. There was a time, it's interesting, that some books, I'm now reading through my whole library and giving all the books away, because this is the last time I'm going to have a chance to read them. I think God is just waiting, or He's got somebody out there who's just waiting to catch me, and I want to refresh my memory about the books that have touched me profoundly and put a kink in my reasoning. And Thomas Kelly, of course, was one of those at that time. Today he reads like a third-grade reader to me. He doesn't touch me anymore because I happen to read somebody else now. And I don't know what the effect of the book has been, but I should think that it has been of great help to many people who are also on a quest.
I read one time a writer said, beware of reading Thomas Kelly.
Yeah, right.
Because when you try to emulate what his story is, it's so very, very difficult and impossible for the average person. beware of Thomas Kelly.
Yeah, you got a point there. You see, let me deviate it from I don't know whether you know Exupéry, the great French poet and philosopher, who wrote a number of books. One of them is entitled Fly to Arras, Wind, Sand, and Sound. And in this one book he says he was escaping on the train from the ruins of Warsaw. You walk through the whole train, all the windows have already been smashed, bombed out. The train is packed with little children and mothers and what have you. And as he walks through the train, he looks at them and he says, the real tragedy are not those ruins out there. They can be rebuilt. Poland will rebuild. The real tragedy is that there may be Mozarts and Goethes and Schillers and Strausses and all the great minds and artists of the past in these children. But no one will ever reach deep down into their being, shake them up and say you were meant to be greatly. What happened to me, you may not have gotten to this part in my book. I fell in love when I came to Canada. I was at that time about 20. With a German girl in a high school. She graduated that year as a valedictorian of her class and played the violin. And since I couldn't read or write, I had a friend of mine write a letter of proposal to her. I had reached a point where I just couldn't go on anymore. And then I didn't eat anything for 3 days and didn't sleep for 4 nights, waiting for a response. And when it came, she expressed her appreciation for my friendship, but ended in the tragic refrain, I couldn't think of marrying you. And I wanted to know why. I could never see her again because this was such a blow to my ego. So I went to the young man who had written the letter. I said, Charlie, you've got to find out why this woman has turned me down. He went to find out and told me that she says you are illiterate. I didn't know what the word meant. Illiteracy had never been a part of my vocabulary. So I asked him what she meant by it. Well, he said, you can't neither read nor write. So by that time I'd become irrational and, no, not irrational because I've dealt with suicides, a dozen of them in my lifetime. Suicide is a very irrational procedure because I've gone through all of the stages. I was in the forest finally with my 33, and just as I was trying to finish it, the sun rose in Canada. I don't know whether sunrises are different in Canada, but this one was. And I couldn't go through with it. So I came home, and of course I couldn't sleep. I was just going days, and then this matured in my life. Never again would a woman turn me down because I was illiterate. They have turned me down for many things. But never again for my illiteracy. You see what, at the end of the book, I have a paragraph of gratitude. If she's still alive, I think she's still alive, she lives in Vancouver now, British Columbia. That this is what Exupéry had in mind. This is what it took to shake me up and say, you can be more than you are, you stinker. You were meant to be great or something. And that set me out on a goose chase. I mean, I don't want to go into how I got my education. I mean, that's a nightmare, but But I made it. Okay, back to Jesus. I mean, he's supposed to be our consideration. I don't know what you are doing. Is that...
Yeah.
That's not going to be my mortality, I guess. Any other questions? Oh my God, we got 1 hour. You better produce. I didn't want to lecture.
I have met any number of people who have had unpleasant experiences in the name of Jesus, where people have said or done things where their upbringing has caused them to have hang-ups about the whole idea of Jesus or Christ. Do you have any suggestions for how a person might deal with that?
Well, you treat this as a rarity. There are hundreds of thousands of people like that out there. Because I have had contact with many of them. And just how would you put it simply? What is your question simply? I
guess I would say that I would wonder what kind of readings, maybe reading some particular things that Jesus wrote to try to divorce that, Jesus, the man of Galilee that you referred to separate that person from what they have heard referred to as the Christ figure. And whether there might be specific passages maybe that would be more meaningful.
Well, the New Testament is really, especially when you take the Revised Standard Version. Oh, I didn't have it yet. I had it yesterday. The Revised Standard Version is really a very readable thing, especially read Luke. The others are a little more confusing, I think. And the essence is the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5 of St. Matthew. But it is difficult to recommend a book because it's fantastic with what people can be reached. Nothing that you may have in mind or anything that you may have in mind might not do anything for them. I had, and I hope you forgive me, I don't want to push my own products here, but I just had a letter since I got to Maine from Canada from a young mother. She was taking her husband to the airport. He had started my book the night before. She said he wouldn't eat, he wouldn't sleep. He read through the night and he had to get a plane somewhere in Ontario. And she was on her way to the airport and he dictated this letter to her and she wrote it and sent it to me. She said he wept all the way down to the airport because he had been searching all of his life and no one seemed to be able to reach him. And now all of a sudden somebody has expressed exactly how he felt. This is sheer guesswork. I mean, I might perhaps never have recommended my book to him. Certainly I don't do that. I'm just too modest. I'm like that monk in Italy who would take people to an art gallery or a monastery, and at the end of the demonstration, the one member in the party asked, "And what about modesty in this institution?" And the priest said, "When it comes to modesty, we are tops."
It's my greatest virtue.
Yeah. Yes.
You had
You said that Jesus was a Galilean. Who for you is Christ?
Amen.
Who is Christ?
Well, the term Christ began to be used I don't think we know quite when, but sometime after the burial of Jesus. It was never used during his lifetime. The word Christian was used in Antioch. I think also after the death of Jesus, and that stuck. And Christ, because when you use the term Christ, you are already including all of these embellishments, that he was born to die for mankind so that God could have a proper relationship to us and so on. So that developed in stages, I think, later on. That would be my impression of it.
I think somewhat differently.
Yeah.
I think that Christ is the Greek for Messiah, and there were people in the Gospels who said you must be the Messiah. And of course, Jesus said, "Don't tell anyone." And a book that I found very liberating as a young man was to read Albert Schweitzer, The Mystery of the Kingdom of God. I don't know if you've read that.
Oh, yeah. I've lectured on Albert Schweitzer for years.
Yes. Well, it's liberating because he dissects. He says, you know, the sort of thing like, everyone knows that the gospel writers took things out of sequence, so the simplest explanation is that the ministry was probably 1 year and not 3. But he goes on to try and explain this mystery. But, well, I found it liberating. I just thought I'd throw that into the ring when someone was asking for a book that gives you a different perspective from... I think the trouble is Messiah meant anointed, and you can go back in the Old Testament and it's hard to find the eschatological expectations of the Jewish people. But in later times, it's come to mean God. But its original meaning wasn't God at all, and so there's an ambiguity about using the word Christ as to whether you're associating it with something to do with the Hebrew expectations of an anointed one, or whether you're putting some medieval interpretation about part of the Trinity or some other construction.
What created a great deal of difficulty was the Jews were waiting. It was at that time, especially after the Roman invasion, and there was so little freedom among the Jews. They hated the Romans. The Jews became very conscious and were hoping and praying for the coming of a representative out of the stem of David. And in time, Messiah became the expression. But the military element of Judaism never saw in Jesus any possibility of getting an army together and knocking the dickens out of the Romans and then liberating the Jews. And so then the pattern began to break down, and they developed the Christological, which became disassociated and incidental from Judaism. Incidentally, if Paul had not come along after what I said about him, I hope you forgive me, although I think it is a bit of history. If Paul had not taken Christianity into Judaism, into the world, the non-Jewish world, it is my conviction that Christianity would have been dead in 200 years, because most of the early disciples insisted, they all kept on identifying Jesus with the Messiah of the Old Testament, the Davidic house of royalty. And when Jesus did not fit into that pattern, of course, they turned against him. And Judaism disassociated itself from Christianity. But those that stayed Christian insisted that a Christian has to be circumcised and that he has to abide by some of the dietary laws. And there you have to give Paul credit. After this radical transformation, the vision that he had on his way to Damascus, He went to Rome for 3 weeks and insisted that Peter also had some experience with animals being dropped down from the sky of all sorts of colors and two-legged and four-legged and so on, which was supposed to mean that before God all people are similar, equal. And so Paul rid Christianity of the obligation of circumcision, and I forgot what the other simple, there were 2 laws.
God, you're
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but it was very specific.
I think it's on.
Well, there was eating meat sacrificed to idols at one stage, but that wasn't.
No, I don't
Later.
think that was it. Anyway, so when the council in Jerusalem finally agreed, because of the experiences Paul had and Peter, then they could go to Rome, to Greece, all over the Mediterranean world and preach the gospel. No longer with the intention that in order to become a Christian you had to become a Jew first. And that opened Christianity to the rest of the pagan world at that time. There was somebody here with a
Yeah, I had a
question.
question. I was just, maybe it partly an answer to the question over here was, what happened to the little girl who said, I didn't do it? I mean, that was one situation. How did you work this kind of thing out?
Well, I don't know what I did then. I was a different person then, and I was much more, I hadn't been made more gentle by Quakers at that time. And I had been struggling against this damnable thing of fundamentalism so long that I had very little patience with it. First of all, I met with the parents, because I didn't know where the parents stood on this, to make sure that they understood me. And then I went to work on the child and took pictures of Jesus holding lambs and little children in books and so on, and won the love of that child, and she never screamed again. As a matter of fact, I asked about her when I was back. I was invited to come back to give a memorial address in my church in Kansas City, and she is doing very well. Now, you just stirred something in my memory. Anyway, other yeah.
I found, for me, what worked was, sounds like it was opposite what worked for you. I found that to focus or to think too much on the man of Galilee was to get caught into the fundamentalist, Jesus is the Savior, you have to devote your life to Jesus. To me, it became a personality cult. And I had very strong resistance to people using this, you have to do this sort of thing. And I found, finally, through a lot of reading, that to go beyond the Jesus personality cult into the Christocentric made it more spiritual and less personality to me, so that it was easier for me to see that the things that Jesus taught were, the love and the openness and the acceptance, were the theory was the important thing, not the person.
Yeah, I had in my church in Cleveland, where I will be tomorrow, was my first congregation church after graduating from Oberlin. I had a Catholic, a wonderful alto voice. She was singing in my choir, but she was Catholic. And one night, somebody in the family called me and told me that Helen had gone haywire, and could I come and do something for her? And here's in a nutshell what had happened there. Her grandmother, she had once said something rather, maybe not even offensive, but her grandmother didn't like it, so she said, someday God is going to punish you for sinning. And what had happened is, Ellen was at this time about 18 or 19 years old when this happened. Her grandmother died.
No.
And all of these years she had lived over this trauma, under this trauma. What is God going to do for me? Now all of a sudden the grandmother died and it had to come true. And so she got panicked. It was interesting, talking about the scriptures. I couldn't find any connection. She was so steeped in popery, in the institution of the Catholic Church and so on, that I finally decided maybe I could get to her in a nutshell what had happened there. Her grandmother, she had once said something rather, maybe not even offensive, but her grandmother didn't like it, so she said, someday God is going to punish you for sinning. And what had happened is, Ellen was at this time about 18 or 19 years old when this happened. Her grandmother died.
No.
And all of these years she had lived over this trauma, under this trauma. What is God going to do for me? Now all of a sudden the grandmother died and it had to come true. And so she got panicked. It was interesting, talking about the scriptures. I couldn't find any connection. She was so steeped in popery, in the institution of the Catholic Church and so on, that I finally decided maybe I could get to her with the Bible. I had to find something that would have been of equal authority to her, to the Pope or the institution. And so one night, and I always had her come, not to my home, or I had an office at home, but we would go to the sanctuary with a magnificent cross over the altar. And I would sit, this happened with a number of Catholics, I would sit there, at least they admire the appointments of the cathedrals. And we started talking, and then I began to read Matthew 15. And all of a sudden, the miracle took place. Somehow, I've never found out how or what her biblical background was, but all of a sudden, this woman could accept the authority of the Bible, the forgiveness, the stories of forgiveness. I read a number of those stories, as being superior to what the Pope represents and so on. And the job was done. She kept on singing in my choir and was a much happier person. I didn't know what was burdening her until this breakdown came with her grandmother. So all sorts of things happened. And they happened not with anything that has to do with life. That is the tragedy of it. Look at the Inquisition. Look at the people burned at the stake, tortured into inhumanity and so on. Over what? Over junk that you and I wouldn't walk around the block for. All concoctions of the human brain. Nothing to do with helping your neighbor or clothing the naked or visiting the shuttings or anything. All fictitious material that you create and then you slug it over other people's heads and make them accept it. That's why I am so bitter against dogma and anything that tries to freeze what may have been originally a great experience. You can take some of the Nicene, imagine the Nicene Creed. I did a mistake. The other night I was traveling with the dean of the Episcopal Cathedral, and I know him very well. I said, how in the heck can I worship in your cathedral now a number of times, and you keep on reciting the Nicene Creed? And he died, descended into hell, was then lifted, sitteth now at the right hand of God, returneth to judge the quick and the dead. Now I asked him. Well, I thought it was humorous, but it wasn't for him. And the dean explained to me how he can keep on doing this. Now, originally, you see, in many of these, in all religions, you had a profoundly religious person who had a great experience. Incidentally, my article in the Quaker Journal had a paragraph on this. You have a profound religious experience. Then you die. I mean, people hear about it and they discuss it and they have you travel and speak to other Quaker meetings and so on and on and on. And then you die. And somebody wants to perpetuate this, who's never had the experience. And so you concoct something. You develop a ritual because you don't know what the original experience has been. This is true of all the world religions, not just Christianity. And before long you have a magnificent constitution, 1,000 bishops, priests, and what have you, keeping it alive. And it keeps on changing and collecting new material, which is then put into the same hopper and sold as the honest to goodness truth. So, don't do it. Anything else? Yeah.
You've been fleshing out a statement that I've framed for myself, which is that I can go along with the religion of Jesus, but not the religion about Jesus. I mean, it's all these beliefs about him and the mythology, as you described it, which is where all the arguments come in the schisms in Christendom and so on. But the religion of Jesus, the things that he lived for and died for, was the heart of it. And I don't think anybody would have too much trouble saying that was a good ideal.
And the only thing you are to live by is the religion that you experience yourself. You, not somebody else. I was so pleased. I got a daughter that did something. She's now on the national staff of the Quaker, the Congregational denomination. And we had lunch together. She is all over the country, calls me every Saturday night from some different state. And I said, it just struck me, I said, Footsie, when I first saw that thing, I wasn't going to have any children, but then I got married and my wife wanted to have children. I never counted on that. But one night at Christmas, she was born the day before Christmas, I was worn out. We had a big dramatic society that was going to put on a big play and so on. I came home at midnight, the telephone rang, and some sweet voice at the other end of the line said, "You've just become a father, you got a daughter." So I crawled into the car, hardly knowing where I was going, went to the hospital, and they rolled her out, and I looked at this thing, hair like a porcupine, all directions. I just thought it couldn't be. Not in my family. And the only thing that came to me was the word Footsie. You'll find it, I've only found it 3 times in German literature since then. And she has been Footsie for me ever since. Her name is Beatrice. I said, Footsie, I'd like to, she wants to preach the way I used to preach. It does a magnificent job. I think she'll outdo me if I don't spruce up a little. I said, Footsie, I want you to tell me what was the most important impression that you have about my preaching. And she said, Daddy, you never told people what they must believe. Now, how she arrived at this, I don't know, but I hope it is true. I never told anybody what they must believe, but I wanted them to find themselves in whatever way, whoever they were, and in whatever way they could possibly do it. So my own daughter endorses my preaching. Any others that don't involve the rest of my family?
Can you say a few words about Tolstoy's view of Jesus? And in particular, I'm curious, the sources of his inspiration. He strikes me kind of similar to some of the early Quakers in that kind of a renaissance or going back to what the original sources were and what the meaning was.
Well, I don't think I should pretend to be able to speak of Tolstoy. I've read him, of course, but he was a very complex personality. There's certainly a strong strand of mysticism in his life. And his commitment to the peasants was without parallel in Russian history. I mean, he gave his whole estate away. He incidentally was married to a woman that came out of a rather affluent home, and they had a very poor relationship. Incidentally, I was in his home in my last trip to Moscow, and the table is still set for 13 people, blue china, and I tried the bicycle he used when the bicycles finally came along with one big wheel. So I have that connection with Tolstoy. We cannot use him, at least I could not use him as an example because Tolstoy never found himself in an integrated, rational, mystical way, the mystic that he was. There were elements, it seems to me, in his personality that never somehow fitted in. And so he went off in different directions. And finally, died on the doorsteps of a monastery, walking out into the night. Would you like to make a comment about him? You may have read him more than I and have a more worthy opinion.
Not a lot. I just was impressed with his ability, well, first it was almost a burning mission to dig into the Gospels and dig back into who Jesus really was, and was able to cut through a lot of the, if you would, current crap at that time and get back to what seemed to me the heart of the man, who the heart of Jesus was, and his.
Well, that was a period of struggle, I mean, because he didn't start that way as a young person. That came later on in his life, after he had accumulated some wealth. He is good to remember because we are going to, well, not you and I, we'll be gone, but Russia is going to play a tremendous role in the future of human civilization, simply because of who the Russian people are. I have described them in an article once. They are the most, in some respects, they're totally unique on our planet because of where they, I had a section of this in my lecture for the other night, but the lecture was a little bit too long, so I cut it out. I was trying to show how the Russian soul was shaped by the geography and the climate and so on where they live. But what you have there is this enormous hinterland where Asia and Europe intermingle. And I'm glad that they are now using the word Eurasians for the Russians, because that's what they are, the blood of Asia and some very little culture of the West ever got there. But there was always interaction here. We lived in here someplace. And here you had the fantastic, the Bashkirs, Kyrgyz and Tatars, Kazakhs, small tribes and so on. This was just a big melting pot. When I was in Russia, the last time, they were still using their textbooks in their high schools, had to be printed in 52 different languages, talk about a melting pot. But they speak over 100 languages in Moscow. And all of this intermingled and created. That's why they are difficult for us to understand, because they are the product of an entirely different climate, entirely different history. And it's good to pay attention to these things. Read Tolstoy Tolstoy. They're fantastic people, and when you realize, I think Norman Cousins, before he died, wrote an article before he gave up Saturday Review of Literature. He said that Russia has produced as much classic music, the great symphonies, as all the rest of the Western world combined. It's just one department of art, in ballet, in architecture, in literature. It provided some of the most unique literature. This was all done under one of the most tyrannical systems in history. So you can imagine, after what is happening now in Russia, and it still takes some time, will have simmered down and become a part of the Russian soul, the present freedom, which they've never known. Russia is about 16 centuries old. No one can predict what contributions they may make to world civilization and science and the arts and so on. And so I'm glad you raised that issue, because we have to, whether we like them or not. I love them. Last time I was over there, I danced with a Kazakh girl, and we almost flew off a three-story. The banquet was at the top of the hotel, and the railing is very low. And we got a little bit too close to the railing. We almost took off, trying to dance a Kazakh polka. I vowed after that I wouldn't dance anymore. Wonderful people, but hospitable. For instance, at first, when I went back first in 1959, I waited after Stalin was finally dead, and I gave him 2 years to cool off, and then I went back. You couldn't meet with any group of people anywhere and talk for a few minutes without people breaking down and weeping. There wasn't a family that hadn't lost 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 members of the family. In Stalingrad, I went back to Stalingrad twice. A beautiful young lady asked me whether I would have a cup of tea with her. So she, in Stalingrad, the first time I was there, was still in much of the ruins. So she led me into some part of a ruin in which there was one room, which was her room. All she had was a couple of chairs and a bunk and a table. And she served tea and some cookies. And a bowl of sugar in one of the most beautiful silver trays. And I looked around, not a picture on the wall, nothing. I said, how in the world did you come by this? She was 15 years old when Hitler moved into Stalingrad. And she was carrying day and night bullets to the cannon to be able to keep the fire going. One night she said I came home, and this tray was all that was left. My 3 brothers, who were younger than I, my parents had happened to be home. Everything was gone, except this tray. Now, you have to experience that to know something about the people in Leningrad, where when Hitler got within the perimeter of Leningrad, there were 3 million people in Leningrad. In my opinion, the second most beautiful city in the world. There were 3 million people at that time. And when they finally, after 999 days, a number of books written about this, and the Germans were finally driven out, 1 million out of 3 were dead. 1 in every 3 people. I went to the cemetery, which is now 50 miles outside of Leningrad, and I had met among tourists 6 other American tourists from other states. And we got the idea of carrying a wreath. The cemetery is almost a quarter of a mile long, and at the other end is an enormous monument of a mother holding a dead child draped over her arm. So we walked down that. We had a cross made out of flowers as tall, and 6 of us were carrying. And somehow somebody got the word that these were Americans from 6 states. And the people simply went wild. We delivered it, put it under the mother with the dead child. And I talked to some of the people that survived. There wasn't a cat or a dog or a rat or a mouse or a crow left in the city, except pigeons. Because pigeon is, taking it from the New Testament, is a sacred bird in Russia. You see many examples of it, even at the University of Moscow. You have an enormous pigeon up there. Everything had been eaten up without apology, and it wasn't shocking a bit. They were talking about cannibalism and so on. People were frozen, they were strung all over the place. We couldn't bury them in the winter, as far as the beacons found. So they ate humans, but most of them died anyway. They found out, for instance, scientifically, that if a person would be fed something at the machine that he was running and not allowed to go home, he would last 18 hours longer. So they would bring him the soup to the machine, and they were able to run the machine 18 more hours before they were dead. And that's how they saved Leningrad. Now, I hope they're going to go back to Petersburg. That's being debated right now. Beautiful. I went through the Royal Park. I don't remember when there was some interesting things. Peter had, old Peter, he tried Quakerism once and didn't know what was going on in the quiet. And so he decided never to go back again because he couldn't learn anything there. But Peter had a very peculiar sense of humor, and he built this magnificent park on the Finnish Gulf, where you sit down on a bench, and he was upstairs. He had the way up on the perimeter, looking down where the royal guests with the voluminous dresses were floating around. And all of a sudden you walk through under a tree and you can, they're so well built that you can't identify them. The tree made out of a tree made by God or by Peter the Great. Some of them were made out of metal. Huge trees. And all of a sudden the thing was turned into a sprinkler. And you never know whether all the traps were buried under the sod, so you never know when you were going to step on them. And I can imagine how Peter sitting up there, you know, with these ladies trying to rescue whatever there was left of their regalia, trying to find some place where it was dry and they didn't know which way to run because water was coming from everywhere. Well, the only connection I can make at this point is that I think Jesus would have loved that part. Anything else? Yeah.
On several occasions in the New Testament, when Jesus is either asked the question or the occasion has arisen, people close to him have identified him as the Messiah, and almost always the Son of the living God. What insight do you have, or what can you shed on this phrase, the Son of God, which apparently was incarnate?
But I'm sorry that I cannot really say anything on it because the way I understand Jesus, when, the Greeks came to him and they said, "Good master, what should we do?" And Jesus apparently said, "Don't call me good. I'm one of you." Now that to me is more Christ-like than saying, "I and God are one." So the book that has just been published indicates that much of this was added later on as the redactors revised the scripture and revised it. You have to remember that this book wasn't published when Jesus was before he left.
Is this book you're referring to, the Spawn book that you mentioned yesterday?
Yeah. Do you know anything about it?
No, I don't. You mentioned it yesterday.
Oh, well, you were here yesterday. Well, yeah, that is a remarkable book. And I wrote Bishop Spong and told him that he has done America a great service. You see, this doesn't, in Europe, you don't have this. The Germans, for ill or for good, got their religion as they got anything else that they learned to read and write. It was part of the national curriculum in the schools. When I came to Heidelberg, for instance, Dr. Schenk, who was my advisor and the head of the Department of Religion in Heidelberg, was teaching one seminar on the Kingdom of God movement in America. So he asked me what I knew about that, and I told him, well, I've not just read about it, I've hit the South Australia. So he had me every now and then embellish the lectures that they gave in this seminar. And the students, the German university students were just aghast. I mean, if you know anything about these revival meetings, I mean, they're almost now died out. But, listen to Swaggart. I get sick in my stomach if I listen to that man for 5 minutes. And I got a pretty stomach. That to me is simply appalling. The man is making millions. How a public with any kind of 4th or 5th grade education can listen to crap of that type and take it. Now when you see him, try to recall your image of Jesus. You're not on the same planet. Because Jesus was a civilized human being, who treated people with respect and so on. And here's his figure. So it's still going on, except that we don't use the South Australia anymore. It's a little difficult to drag a TV set in there, I guess. So we do it in TV stations. But the idiocy is the same. These people have no education, they have no concept of history, and so they just garble their own stuff. So much for Schwager. But he particularly, I can tolerate nothing about that. But it just goes beyond me. Anything else? Whom else would you like to attack? No, this, I want to recommend this book. I think the second edition was to be out soon. It's entitled Rescuing the Bible from the Fundamentalists. And this is biblical.
Rescuing what?
Rescuing the Bible from the fundamentalists. And it deals with all of these this nonsense. And he does it on the basis of scriptures. He gives you all the textual references at the bottom of the page. So if you have any question, you can look it up and verify it and so on. And I think he is going to be a great help to many people who couldn't.
Who's the author?
Spong, John
Bishop.
S-P-O-N-G.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the Episcopal bishop in, he's in the New England states in Connecticut, I think.
He used to be in Richmond.
Or you know him?
Well, just,
Yeah. He has been a rather controversial
Mhm.
fellow. But for instance, if you want to know a sensible Christ-like interpretation of heterosexuality, of homosexuality, and so on, this is the book you can trust. It is another department in which there is so much evil being set up. All right, I'm at your service. We got about 10 more minutes. If you have any. If not, I've enjoyed. I think I've made more friends at this yearly meeting and gained more respect than some people do in a lifetime. Thank you very much.
Have you seen him on the tennis court?
Big what?
Have you seen him on the tennis court? I
Well,
heard he's
I'm
been
glad-
there.
He got beat.
I'm glad they weren't there today.
Well, we talked about yesterday.
Yeah,
She was fair.
Yeah, but I didn't.
Boy,
I was near him in lunchtime.
It started about that time. It was one of the, I think, one of the reactions to the Romans, the Greeks had driven up by, were being driven up by the Romans during that period when life was cheap.
Oh, sure enough, she hasn't been
So they spread very rapidly. That Christianity continued.
No, I don't take it right now.
I don't never did.
Take a picture of you.
Are you able to keep pressing? At Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, on July 24th, 1991.